Hello everyone, in this video we are going to look at how you can return a value from an asynchronous call in JavaScript. We're going to look at 3 different methods, so let's get started. So in order to understand how you can return a value from an asynchronous call, we first need to understand what's the difference between asynchronous and synchronous functions. So let's write a synchronous function. I'm going to write a synchronous function called add, and I'm going to pass 2 parameters to it, a and b. Now we will simply add a and b, and we would return the value. So this is a normal synchronous function in JavaScript, which would run from top to bottom. There is no asynchronous call in this function. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to declare a variable called sum, and I'm going to store the value of adding 2 and 1 in this sum. So we are executing this add function and saving the value to sum. Now let's just log the value of sum to the console and see what we get. As we expected, we got 3, right? So let me just add a comment to this console log as well so that we remember which console log is returning what. All right, so sum, and let's execute it once again. Good. So we're getting sum as 3 as we expected it. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an asynchronous function. Let's call this asynchronous function as async add. And again, let's pass 2 arguments a and b. And we are going to add these 2 arguments. But in order to fake an asynchronous call, I'm going to use a setTimeout function. Now this setTimeout function takes in 2 parameters. One is the function itself, and second is the time that you want to wait for before this setTimeout function is executed. So 2000 means 2000 milliseconds. So it's basically going to wait for 2 seconds. Now I'm going to return the sum of a and b in this setTimeout function. Now let's just declare another variable. Let's call this async sum, and let's execute this async add function, and let's do it with 2 and 3. Now let me log the value of this async sum to the console. Let's say async sum. Let's concatenate async sum variable. Now let's execute this script and see what we get. Now you see we get undefined. Now here is what you need to understand, the difference that lies between the asynchronous function and the synchronous function. So the async add function is executed and it sets a timeout. So this can be your API call. We are just faking it with a setTimeout function. So basically this function takes 2 seconds to return anything. Now by that time, JavaScript goes to the next line, and over here in next line, there's nothing that is returned from the function. So the value here remains undefined. That's why in the console, you're getting undefined as the value, because the async sum variable does not hold any value. It holds undefined. And a synchronous function returns 3 because there is no asynchronous call within it. So this is the crucial difference between the asynchronous and synchronous functions that you need to understand. There are 3 methods that we can use in order to return something, in our case, the sum from the async add function. And we're going to look at all these 3 methods in this tutorial. The first one is a node style callback functions. Now let's declare our first node style callback function, and I'm going to call this function as callback sum. And I'm going to pass in 3 parameters here. A, B, and a callback function. Now we'll look at why I have passed this callback function in a moment. Now we are going to use the set timeout as we used in the async add function again. I'm going to pass in the first function as an argument. And then second, I'm going to pass 2000 milliseconds as the waiting time. Now within this, we're going to declare sum and we're going to add A and B as we did in our async add function. Now the beauty of this callback function is that the set timeout function itself would be executed after 2 seconds. Now the set timeout is going to calculate the sum, that is A plus B, and the sum variable will contain that value of whatever A plus B is. And after that, this callback function would be fired. The sum would be passed in as the argument to this callback function. So we can basically get the sum as the argument to our callback function, and we can retrieve the value of sum. Now let's see how we can do that. So let's fire the callback sum function. I'm going to say callback sum. And for A and B, so A and B, I'm going to use 3 and 3. And for callback function, I'm going to pass in an anonymous arrow function. And here I will get sum as a default argument because we have used that within the set timeout call. So let me console log sum here, and let's say sum from callback function. And let's concatenate the value of sum here. Cool. Now let's try to execute the script in our console and let's see what we get. It waits for 2 seconds. Let me just expand this view for you guys. So it waits for 2 seconds and it returns sum as 6. And that's what we exactly expected from this. So basically over here, you have returned the value from an asynchronous call. So you can imagine this to be returning a value from an API call or any other asynchronous call that you're doing. But this is how you would do it in case you're working with Node and if you want to use callback functions as a basis of returning values from an asynchronous call. Let me create some space here. Now let's look at the JavaScript promises. Now this is another way of returning something from an asynchronous call. So I'm going to declare a JavaScript function which returns a promise, and I'm going to name this function as promise sum. Again, it takes 2 parameters, A and B. What's different about this function is that it's going to return a promise. So let's return a new promise. Now, whenever you return a promise, you pass in a function to it. Now, this function would have 2 arguments. One is resolve and the other one is reject. So whenever a promise is resolved, you fire the resolve function. And whenever a promise is rejected or there is an error in what you're trying to do, you fire the reject function. So I'm going to use a try and catch block within this promise that we are returning. Again, I'm going to try and fake asynchronous call using this set timeout function and set the timer to 2000 milliseconds itself. And within this set timeout function, I'm again going to calculate the sum for A and B. So we have the sum for A and B within the set timeout function. Now, since we have calculated the sum here, I'm going to resolve the promise and I'm going to pass that sum as the value as an argument to my resolve function. And with the try and catch block, I can use the catch block to catch any error. And just in case there is any error, I'm going to reject the promise saying that it caused an error. And then I'm going to pass in this error as the argument to my rejection call. So let's understand the promise sum function once again. It's a normal arrow function and it returns a promise. This promise would obviously have resolve and reject as its arguments. We are using a try and catch block here. And within the try block, we are first trying to calculate the sum of A and B. And we are using a set timeout function here so that it fakes an asynchronous call. And just in case it is able to calculate the sum successfully, we are resolving the promise, else we are rejecting the promise, right? Let's try to fire this promise sum function here. So I'm going to say promise sum. Let's use 3 as A and 4 as B this time. So whenever you fire a function that returns a promise, you can use then and catch to resolve the promise. So then is fired when the promise is resolved successfully, and catch is fired just in case there is any error or there is a rejection in the promise or the promise is not fulfilled. So when we pass this then block, we can console log the sum, and we can say sum from promise, and I can concatenate sum. Obviously, I would need to pass sum as the argument as well. So here, my promise, if it resolves, it will console log my sum from the promise itself. Let's execute this in our console and see what we get. This is what we expected. Sum from the callback function, and here is the sum from the promise. So basically we have looked at two methods how we can return something from an asynchronous call. Now let's look at the third method itself. The third method is async and await. We are going to use the same promise function to return something from our asynchronous call, but this time we are going to do it using the async await method. Now, async await is just a different syntax. You can consider it as a different syntax to return anything from the promise. So instead of using then and catch block, it's a different syntax to resolve promises. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new function. I'm going to call it async await. Again, A and B as the parameters to this arrow function. I'm going to use a try and catch block to execute the promise function. But apart from try and catch, we have to use the async keyword. Now, async keyword, using this before defining your function, makes your function asynchronous. What do I mean by that? We'll have a look in a moment. So what I'm going to do here is in my try block, I'm going to say let sum is equal to await promise sum function and pass A and B to it. So what this basically does is that it waits for the promise to resolve and return something. So in our try block, it's going to wait for the promise to resolve and return something, and whatever is returned would be saved in our sum variable. So let me console log this, console.log. Let me say sum from async await, and then let's use the sum variable here. So instead of using this dot then and dot catch, we are using a try catch, but with await keyword and waiting for the promise to resolve and automatically save everything to our sum variable. So let's fire this async await function and pass 4 as A and B, and let's execute our script and see what we get. So here you can see we are getting the result that we expected from our async await and the rest of them as well. So asynchronous function is returning sum. Undefined is coming from an asynchronous function where we are not handling it properly. And then the callback function and the promise, all of them are returning the values as we expect from them. That's it for this video, guys. I hope this video has been helpful. And if you haven't subscribed to my channel, please do so. It helps the channel, as well as I keep posting interesting stuff related to JavaScript. Thanks for watching.